Hello, it's Lauren with Lauren Elizabeth Animal Art. I'm on day 333 of my 365 days of color. In this tutorial, part 2 of Finn the Silken Windhound's painting, I'll be giving you a mini crash course on color value. You'll be a pro by the end of this tutorial. And if you already haven't, make sure you nominate your pet down below for a chance to become my next tutorial. All right, guys, let's get painting. All right, so part 1, if you missed it, is linked down below. This is part 2, where I'm going to show you a very easy way that you can understand color value. I'll walk you through step by step using just black and white. So if you can master this grayscale, you can pretty much paint your animal portraits with any colors as long as it matches that value. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. I'm going to simplify value into dark, medium, and light values. So here's a little example I made with the largest bubbles from left to right being your dark value of gray, then your medium value of gray, and then light value of gray. Now, as we paint Finn, you'll notice that there are many, many different shades of gray between each of these grays. Like if you mixed a little of your medium gray value with the light gray, that's the smaller bubble above those two, and that's what I call light to medium gray. Same thing if you mixed a little of your dark value with the medium gray, that would be what I call dark to medium gray. So in this tutorial, we'll be mixing up all different values or shades of gray. But it's a lot easier to find these in between grays if you can just focus on the three, the dark, the medium, and the light values. And don't worry, you don't have to mix up the exact mixture of gray as me. As long as you're somewhere within that range, you're golden. And then by the end of this tutorial, once you really have grasped color value, you can choose really any color in the rainbow to paint your animal portraits, because we're not focusing on matching color here, we're finding the relative lightness or darkness of a color. We'll pick up where we left off in part 1, working on Finn's face with a dark gray. So right now, mix up a dark gray with more black, a little bit of white. I'm using my size 1 Arteza spot brush. Where we can add this, there's this little indent along behind the right eye. And so this wraps around because we have white fur along here, just a thin strip. But this comes up like that. This area is a bit more of a lighter gray. What I'm trying to do is help you see those subtle differences in gray. Our light source is hitting Finn from the far left side, so mostly everything on the right side of Finn will be a dark gray or a medium gray. Now that's aside from the white fur. We'll be using light and medium grays for that white fur because it's white. But for those medium gray areas, I'll leave those white, and then I'll either layer or blend them in very soon. Now while that's still wet, let's pull in some more of those light grays so that we can start blending. So I'm just turning that dark gray into a medium gray by adding lots of white to it. Because this area is where we have a little bit of lightness, and right above the head, I'm going to even add more white because that's not quite light enough. And I'm just carefully blending that into that area of the dark gray we added. Now I'll be using the blending and the layering technique in this tutorial. Right here in the face, we'll do a lot more blending. And we'll also add some on below that, which fades into a white. So here's where I'm going to pull in even more white. So I'm pulling in more white to that medium gray to make a light to medium gray. The littlest strip of light gray right here. Now don't get too caught up on detail. It's hard enough to learn value, and then on top of that, figuring out the placement of them. Just take your time. Our focus is just covering up the white at the beginning, and then we'll tighten things up towards the end. And I can just add the faintest little light gray strip right above the eye, like that. And it's even right below too, around that dark gray border. So while that paint is still wet, I'm adding a slight little bit of light gray around the eyes. All right, so I'm going to go back to my dark gray. We're just going to go back and forth between dark, medium, and light gray. That's pretty much the majority of this painting. I'm going to mix up a tiny bit of white into my black. And this is a very dark gray that we want to add to the inner ear. Now there's different ways you can go about applying these values. You could start with your darks and apply all your darks, as many as you could see, and then go in with layering your medium values and then layering your light values. For dogs that have so many different shades and multicolored fur, I like to do more blending because I sometimes can lose track of all those different values. So that's when I'll apply colors by body part. So I'll just focus on the head, and then I might move to the legs and then the back. All right, I'm going to add a little bit of white to that because we have these little fuzzy stray hairs that are coming out from the inside of the ear. So to get that, I'm just going to cluster these curvy lines. And it seems like they're longer down here, but they get a little shorter up there. There's almost none up here. They're the longest down here and they're a little curvy. And I'm going to cluster those lines until I have like none up here. So I'm still using my dark gray and I'm cutting into the background. That's why it's so important that we get that background done before applying fur over top. And then I'll continue that gray up the end of the ear. I can fill that in with this dark gray. Kind of wraps around the top of it. All right, mix up some more of that dark gray because we're going to move on. It just had a little bit of white in it. We're going to move on to the inside of the left ear. This is an interesting ear because I think I should have added more turquoise to it than I had before. Well, here's where I'm going to say pause. If you don't have that turquoise filled in behind this left ear like I have, I would say just pause from your dark gray for a second, mix up bright aqua green with a little bit of white, and fill that area in. Now you can wait till the end, but it will make clustering those lines under the ear so much easier. Now I'll be adding more white to this black to create a medium gray, which we'll use to outline the outer part of Finn's left ear. I'll also use this medium gray to add some more length to these strands below the ear. Just be careful, they don't go longer than the end of that ear. Now, if you see in this step and in the next, we'll just be using our medium gray. In the areas that are getting hit by the light, they actually, in these areas, look like a light gray, but I can still create some kind of base. So they're not going to be dark gray. I'll go with my medium gray as a base, and then we'll further outline them and touch them up with our highlights towards the end. And I find with this wavy type fur, it's much easier to just keep a thin amount of paint on a spot brush or a liner brush, some kind of detail brush so that you can create each individual strand. I find that it's a little bit more challenging to do this with a flat brush, even though you can. So with your detail brush and a thin amount of paint on it, just use the tip of your brush and not much pressure. That way you don't create such thick lines. I'm going to go back to my dark gray and fill in the area behind there. I'm going to make sure I miss those white markings There's just a little strip on the back of his head. And this curls down and around that fuzz. All right, so we're going to mix up a medium gray that's lighter than the medium gray we used on Finn's right side of his face. So just add more white to this gray we were just using. We'll fill in the entire area around his left eye, except for where we start to see white fur on his snout. I'm going to go even lighter for the area below his eye, so I added more white to that gray. But I noticed that this area could go darker. Okay? So I'm going to go back to my dark gray. So I have my dark, medium, and light gray. I'm going to go back to that dark gray and bring this up more. It's just going to nicely blend into that lighter gray. And this even cuts down into that light border a little bit more than I had it. I'll even pull some of this dark gray down from the top of the head. All right, moving down along the right side of the neck, I'm going to go back to my dark gray, because right here there's some dark gray that kind of cuts up into the ear. It almost makes like a triangle. And then that leads to a lighter gray, not a light gray, but more of a medium gray. And that just connects the neck, kind of folds into the side of the neck. And then from there it goes to a light gray. And then right here, there's a dark gray line. So going back to my dark gray. A little shadow being created on the fur, which if you watch me, I'm going to pull some more of this light gray into that dark gray so that I can blend it down. If you missed that, I laid down a tiny bit of dark gray where we see that shadow, then blended some light gray down because that's how the fur is laying. But then there's the slightest little light gray right here, which I'm still going to include even despite that bow tie. But I think what's important though, this is why we put the connected part before the fur, is I'm going to take my light gray, and now that our bow tie should be dry, I'm going to let some of this fur just cut over top. See how I'm doing that? I'm clustering little short little lines over top that bow. And that's using light gray. Very short clusters of lines using just the tip of your brush to prevent those strands from getting too thick. All right, so let's mix up a good amount of our light gray. Just a tiny, tiny little bit of black and a good amount of white. And what we're gonna do, the easiest way I think is just to fill in the entire white part of the snout that we have left over. Oh, that's a little too dark. I'm gonna add more white to it. And we're just gonna fill in this entire area. And then we'll go in with our lowlights. Now I just want to note here that we'll be blending medium gray into some areas here on his white snout. So this paint here still needs to be wet when we do that next step. And then I'm going to add just the smallest little bit of black in there to create a medium gray, which I'll place on this line in the center between the eyes. Goes all the way up the head. We're just blending it in and bringing it all the way down to the snout. Now I'll add just a pinhead amount of black into this medium gray to make it a dark to medium gray that I'll be adding in 3 areas. The very top of Finn's nose, the left side of his snout, and to make 4 little dots around his snout. You'll see I do it on the left and right of his snout. And that leads me to our next color tip. That's all I recommend you add at a time, a pinhead amount of color, especially if it's your darker, more dominant colors. So darker colors like black, blue, red, violet will often overpower the lighter colors if you're not careful. So anytime you're trying to darken a lighter mixture of paint, add the tiniest bit at a time and slowly add in more until you get to the desired color. If you notice, the dots on the right side of Finn's snout are just slightly darker. So I'm going to add the smallest pinhead amount of black into my gray to darken it up. I'll add that to the left side, a little bit on the top of the nose, and there's actually a little shadow on the right side lower by the nose as well. It's just the smallest little shadow there. All right, great. So we're going to work on our darkest values now, first on the back and around the limbs. So I'm going to start with black with a little bit of white. We're going to start fresh with a dark gray. And I really see this dark gray in the tail, which I'll paint the entire tail. Just goes right off the canvas. And then I can pretty much apply this dark gray, yep, all the way up the back. So very carefully with my Filbert brush, by the way, this is size 2 Filbert brush. I'm rounding this area because right above it is a patch of white fur, which we'll use a medium and light gray to fill in this area. And below it, and to the far right, we'll use lots of our dark grays. I'll just carefully work along Finn's spine and then work to the left from there. All right, I'm going to carry this dark gray underneath the right side of the right of the bow. I'll just start bringing it down. And I'm going to thicken up this strip along the back. Just going to thicken it up with a dry brush, meaning I haven't added any more paint. I'm just bringing it down. And I'm slowly going to add in a little bit more white to that. But I'm just clustering lines, scattering them, making them look fuzzy. This particular fur that Finn has is unique in that it's patchy with some dark gray, some medium gray, and even some light gray strands in there. And that's why I'm using blocky, wispy, inch-long brush strokes that I'll slowly lighten up as we move to the left. All right, I'm gonna add a little bit more white to that. You just wanna add a little bit of white at a time. All right, and I'll stop about there for my gray because I want to start painting it in now. I'm just going to mix up that same amount of that gray, which is like a medium to light gray. It's right there in between a medium and light gray. So this area is where I'm going to block in the gray. Below that is more white. All right, now I'm going to start working along this area, this line. And I'm not going to take it all the way to that outline because that becomes more white. See how I left a white border around here? I want to keep that for a lighter gray. I'm running out, so I'm going to mix up more of this gray. Now in a second, I'll be switching to my size 1 round brush, and with a medium gray, make sure it's not too dark, okay? This is our white fur that's in shadow. I'll carefully work these low lights around the lower belly and limbs. So this medium value will be our darkest value for the white fur. And that leads me to my next color tip. With white fur, you don't want to go darker than the medium value. That might sound confusing because it's the medium value, but with white fur, we want to make it look white. So you want to work with your light and medium values. For say dark brown or black fur, or even like caramel colored fur, you want to work with your dark and medium values with a few light values. Does this make sense? And it's also a shadow being created right here along this line on the belly that goes in towards the legs like that. If you notice, I left the thinnest white border at the front of Finn's belly for those highlights. Now that gray will do very well. I'm just going to mix up some more. I'm even going to add more white to it. Yes, I'm going to add more white to that gray. We're getting that shadow on this left side of the arm. Again, as you're painting, carefully leave a thin border around these front limbs. This light to medium gray will also go on the upper shoulder, the back of Finn's neck, the side of his belly, and the white fur left on the back of his legs. So I recommend mixing up enough if you haven't already. Also, are you starting to see the shapes that these values are making? As we place these values next to one another, take note to the kind of shapes they're forming. And along the back of the neck. And this gray will work really nicely right here. I'm going to just go a little bit darker now because we want to get on the bottom of the feet. Here I'll mix up a dark to medium gray, which I'll use to outline the toes on the feet closest to us. Now it's mostly darker on that back foot closer to the front foot because the shadow is being created, but as we move towards the back of that foot it gets lighter, so I'll add in more white to this gray. Now let's take a much needed break from that fur for a moment. I'm going to go back to my red that I used to paint the bow tie and I'll add a second layer. And that leads me to my next color tip. I like to do this around the middle to end to brighten colors and to make them more pigmented by adding a second, third, or even fourth coat. And this is what I'm doing right here to the bow tie. And if your red has dried, what we used is cadmium yellow, lots of permanent red, and a little bit of white. All right, so here until the end, we'll be really focusing on detail and adding contrast. So how we do that is we use our small detail brushes to create fur texture, and we'll add more layers or adjust the current ones we've already added. It's these next steps that take us out of the ugly phase and to our finished piece. Now I'm going to mix up what I call a joiner color for the strip of gray on Finn's belly. It's a mix between a medium gray and a light gray. So if it helps, you start with your light gray and then slowly add a pinhead amount of black at a time to get to your light to medium gray. Now I'll also use this gray to both darken up the lower front limb and extend that border out a bit. I just left a little too much white there. I'll not fill the entire front limb, but almost. So if you watch me, I'm climbing up that limb and shoulder, clustering lines very carefully close together. So that's important. I'm not covering up all the previous layer. I'm adding these smaller layers over top that create depth and help me to manipulate the values, get them just right. I'll also add this on that white patch of fur on Finn's back, but again, not covering up all that previous layer, just more closer towards the bow. Now we're not done with this gray yet because I'll use it to define the little toes on the back foot and touch up the toes on the front foot closer to us. All right, so let's mix up a very light gray. It should almost look white. And this is a light gray we'll be using to create those strong highlights bordering the front of Finn's body. So all along the left side of Finn and the white borders that we left, we'll just use this to fill that in. Now on Finn's shoulder here, right underneath the left side of the bow, there's a good amount of fur that's just sticking out to the background. So very carefully cutting into the background, I'll add just a little bit more length to these strands up here. Again, pretty much all the white borders that we left around Finn's body and limbs, feet, that's what we'll use this gray for. Now I recommend you watch me first, but I'm going to very carefully, without going over too much gray, I'm going to highlight the entire left side and the top of his head. So I'll be highlighting those light grays, the medium grays, and even those dark gray fur strands underneath Finn's ear. I'll individually add highlights to them. We'll want to highlight the right ear fur and carefully curl it like we did when we were applying the base of these strands and the top of this ear. This is the side that's facing the light source. You notice I'm not going to highlight the right side of Finn's right ear. Now for me, my light gray has dried, so after a few tries, I get the light gray that matches the same light gray we've been using. And that leads me to my next color tip. I've said this quite a lot in my tutorials, but if you're new here, anytime you're trying to match colors or values, don't be afraid to test out colors. So maybe on a separate canvas or even on the one you're working on, we can always let it dry and paint over it. Over the years, I've become so comfortable with quickly mixing up a color that I know I need, and it just kind of happens, and I think it's just because of so many times that I've tested out colors and seen how little or how much I need to get that color. So be patient with yourself now, because it really does happen. You develop that eye over time. I really do promise you if you keep practicing. So if you missed that, there is a slight highlight around the dark gray fur on Finn's right shoulder, and I made it look more furry, so just clustering lines vertically. I'll also add some more fur texture on that back leg and on the back of Finn's neck. All right, so now I'm going to show you how to do this dark gray fur, this unique fur that Finn has where there's patches of dark gray and medium gray and light gray. We'll start with our darks like always. I'm going to make a very dark gray, a little bit of white, lots of black. And if you notice, there's kind of rows of these patches of fur and they're around the same length. So I'm going to start with this back leg and I'm going to work from bottom up. Like I keep saying, watch me first and then try it. So I'm leaving some pretty wide gaps between these clusters of lines, and some are wider than others. Other strands I have more closely together. I'm also going to take some of these, cutting into a little bit into that light gray right here. Then right above this row, I'm going to leave a gap of our medium gray that's below this for our base layer. And I'm going to do the same thing, working up the top of that back leg. I noticed that a little bit of this gray cuts into the top around Finn's kneecap. I kind of want to make it a little bit less dark, so I'll pull in a little bit of white there. So that'll be a medium gray that I cut into some of that white. And I'll also add a little bit of this to the front kneecap, but not going all the way up to the top. I'll also add a few clusters of lines to the side of Finn's belly, but I then came to realize that it needs more white. So I then add more white to make it a little bit lighter gray. And that's when I noticed there is a slight shadow being casted from that front leg on the back leg, so I add a little bit of this medium gray there too. Now I decided while we're working on this medium to light gray, I'm going to start adding that color patches on Finn's back. So I see this really strong light one right here. That's probably the lightest one of all. And then I'm just going to scatter them throughout the dark and medium gray. Now it's really important that as you're laying down the real dark and the real light strands, that you take note to the direction they're laying. And then as you're laying them down, keep a thin amount of paint on your brush. So wash it out, dab it on their cloth, and then pick up a small amount of paint so that you're not having some strands be thick and then some be very thin. You want them all even width. And next we'll mix up a medium gray that we'll also add in rows and clusters. And that's what I pretty much do here until the end of the tutorial. I go back and forth between my dark, medium, and lights, just adding more and more layers. I will admit this part took me the longest. It was a little difficult trying to get that texture right, but just keep patient and try not to focus so much on getting each strand in the exact spot. Just keep those rules in mind I went over, keeping them in rows, keeping the width the same, making sure the length is about the same too, and having them go in the correct direction. But I will say the majority of the darkest strands of fur are closest to Finn's spine and right below the bow. All right, so we're going to take a break from that back fur. We're nearly finished, creatives. We are just adding the final details here. They're really tiny ones too. So I'm going to go back to a light gray that I'll add just to touch up that fur once again below and around Finn's back leg. This is a little reminder to make sure you step back from your own painting and look at what it needs. Sometimes we can get so caught up on my painting that you don't even notice the little details that could really help your own painting because it's going to be slightly different. I'm going to mix up a dark gray that I'll add to just bring down some of that medium gray below Finn's left ear. I'll mix up a medium gray. It's more of a medium to dark gray for this back leg that I'll have some strands cutting over that back foot. And I'll also use this to add another shadow below that back foot. All right, I'll go in with just white now to get those really strong highlights on the left side of Finn's face. And then after that, we'll go in with just white to do the highlights on his body on the left side. Now, here's where I'm going to mix up my turquoise with my white. If you already haven't, make sure you fill that little area underneath Finn's left ear between those fur strands. All right, so here until the end of this tutorial, guys, I'll be fiddling more with that dark gray fur on Finn's back. Just adding more and more layers of our dark, medium, and light strands. All right, we have reached the end of this tutorial, guys. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Have a blessed holiday. Bye.